What's going on, guys? Welcome to this episode of Home Built Workshop, and welcome to episode number 4 of my Great Guitar Build-Off series. Today's a very exciting episode. It is now time to get some color on this top and start spraying some finish, so stick around. This episode is a big episode for me because I've really been waiting to get the color on the top. I've been doing some testing, playing around with some colors, and I think I've got everything figured out. I've got my colors all mixed up. I've got a ton of rags. Look at that, I even have some gloves. That's a rare occurrence around here. In episode number 3, we got all of these parts ready for finish. Everything is sanded. All we really need to do now is start applying some dye. The dye that I'm going to be using is this Transfast water-soluble dye. This stuff comes in a ton of different colors. You can mix and match to get the exact shade that you want. I like to use these little mason jars to mix them up. I found that it works really well for me. Remember those scrap pieces that I saved when we cut the top out on the bandsaw? Those were specifically so that I could do some tests on my colors. It's important to test on the exact same piece of wood if you can to make sure you get the right combination. So let's get some color on this guy. Before we even open up any of the dye, I'm going to run some tape around the outside edge of the body. This is going to help if I get a little bit carried away with the dye, and hopefully help keep any dye from running down the sides of the body, potentially staining it to where we can't remove that spot. When I'm applying the tape, I'm making sure that it does not stick up above the top of the guitar. If it sticks up above the top, it could potentially be an area where the dye can pool and cause more running. Here we go. The first dye that I'm going to apply is called Honey Maple. I've mixed it up really dark and also added some dark brown mahogany. I'm going to use this as the base coat for the control cavity as well as the guitar. Most of this is going to get sanded off, but the idea is that the darker brown is going to give some depth to the color once we get the other colors applied. You can already see some of that grain starting to pop. I'm going to be very slow and careful when I'm applying the dye. I'm never going to start at the edge and always work from the center out. This is again to minimize any dye running down the side of the instrument. Once that coat of dye has dried, I'm going to sand it with some 400 grit to remove almost all of the color. It's just going to leave some of the brown into the grains of the wood. I'll remove all of the sanding dust with some compressed air, and now we can move on with some actual colors. Now I can begin applying the red dye. I just use some good quality paper towels that don't tear up into little bits to apply the dye. As I'm applying the dye, I'm always working from the center out. I never want to start applying the dye from the edge of the instrument. That can cause the dye to pool at the edges and run down the side, and that's exactly what we're trying to avoid. That's why I always apply the dye from the center toward the outside edge. Without waiting for that red to dry, I'm going to switch right to orange and keep applying dye, trying to blend the edges as I go. Right now I'm not super concerned with getting it blended perfectly. We're going to be able to adjust that shortly. After the orange, I'm going to go straight to the yellow. This goes right in the center of the guitar. Now I'm going to go back to the red and reapply it around the outside edge. This is going to help darken it up. I'm also going to reapply the orange and the yellow as well. Now I'm going to go back in with a clean paper towel, and this step is why I really like working with these water-based dyes. I've dampened the paper towel with a little bit of water. It's not sopping wet, but it's just damp, and now I can go back and basically move the color around on the surface to get the blend that I want. When blending the colors, I like to work in a circular pattern. By going in a circle, you're basically pulling the red into the orange and the orange into the red, the yellow into the orange, and vice versa. This really helps you get a nice blend. That looks awesome. I'm really happy with the way that turned out. I'm going to let that dry overnight before we move on. So I've let the dye dry overnight. It's good and dry. I'm just going to untape this real quick. Looking at the edges, I don't see any areas where the dye bled down the sides, which is awesome. We don't have a whole lot of cleanup to do. A lot of that is because I was being very careful applying the dye, always wiping off the edge, never starting at the edge and pulling towards the center of the guitar. When you do that, the edge acts like a wiper and causes the dye to pool, and that's when you get a lot of bleed. The tape was just a little bit of extra precautions, but most of it I believe is due to technique. You want to be very careful when you're wiping that on, especially if you want to retain that nice maple edge, kind of a faux binding. Now I'm going to go in with some 400 grit paper and lightly make a few passes around the outside edge of the body. This is going to slightly round over the edge, give us just a tiny bit of a maple reveal from the top, and it'll really soften that corner. Now I can tape off the neck pocket to keep the finish out of there, and I'll attach a board which I'll use as a handle while I'm spraying the finish. Let's get some finish on this thing. For the neck, I'm using a finishing oil because I really like the feel of an oil finish on a neck. After a few minutes, this finish begins to get tacky. Then we're going to go back with a clean paper towel, wipe off the excess, set it aside, let it cure for about 2 hours. Then I'll just repeat this process a couple of times as the finish starts to build. I use a little piece of wire through one of the tuner holes. I can just hang this up in a safe spot while we work on the body. We're going to apply the finish for the body using a spray gun. I'm going to be spraying on this bright tone made by Crystalac, and really since it's so dry here, I'm also going to be adding some retarder to slow down the drying. Our humidity here is so low that if you don't use the retarder, the finish dries too quickly, almost before it even has a chance to flow out nice and smooth, so this really helps. I'm not going to go into a ton of details about the spraying process because we could probably make a whole video about just using a spray gun. So let's mix up some of this stuff and get it on the body. This is the part of the show where I spill finish all over everything. Stir well before using. I'm going to do a little bit of an experiment while spraying the clear. A month or two ago in one of my weekly live streams, we were talking about spraying and having a proper area to spray, and one thing that came up was using a tent as a spray booth. I thought that sounded like a cool idea, so I got this old tent that we're going to set up and try to use that as a spray booth. I don't know how it's going to work, but we're going to give it a shot and see what happens. I think it turned out to be about the windiest day ever while I'm trying to do this, as you can probably tell by the way the tent's flapping around. I only ended up spraying one coat in here, but at least I can say I tried it. That tent idea, yeah, kind of sketchy. I didn't really have enough room to fully move around, although this was I think an 8 or a 10-man tent. I thought it'd be big enough, but it was kind of awkward, and the wind was blowing and the sides were flapping, and there was some screened vents in there that I couldn't close off, so I was still getting dust blowing in there. Maybe if this tent was sealed off a little more and I could have got it set up where it wasn't flapping around, it might have worked a little bit better, but overall, yeah, I'm gonna do the rest of this inside. Growing up around an auto body shop, I've definitely spent some time using a spray gun, but one thing that I'm really discovering is that it's one of those skills that if you don't use a lot, you definitely get out of practice, and it takes a little bit of time to develop that muscle memory again. After a couple of coats though, I'm feeling a lot more confident with my spraying ability. I still need some more practice, but it also would be a lot nicer if I had a little bit more room to get around things. I guess that's just one of the challenges we face when we have a small shop. Of course, the air compressor's got to kick on right in the middle of everything. I'm going to continue repeating this process until I've built up about 8 to 10 coats. And now, we wait. We need to let this finish cure for at least a day per coat, so I need to wait about a week and a half before I can move on to the next step. This part kills me because I just want to get it together. We're so close. The next step is going to be to get this level sanded and then polished up to a nice high gloss finish, and then we can begin the assembly, but it's got to dry first. I'm going to take this opportunity to do some cleanup around the shop, knock out a couple smaller projects that I've been meaning to do, but take a look at this. This is dry to the touch right now. It's got a nice gloss on there already, a little bit of level sanding and some polishing. This is going to be awesome. So I'll see you guys in a week and a half. Well, that was the longest 12 days ever, but finally, here we are. This finish is nice and cured. It's got a really nice shine to it right now, but it's not completely flat, and that's what we need to do right now. I've got some good quality 1000 grit sandpaper, and we're going to dry sand this first round. We're going to sand the front, back, the entire guitar to get the finish nice and flat, ready to move up in grits and get this thing really shined up. I'm going to sand most of the larger surfaces using this hard rubber sanding block. One little tip though is if you're going to use a block like this, make sure the bottom is flat. When I first put a straight edge on this, it had a really bad bow, and that's going to give you bad results if you start sanding it like that. So I run it on some sandpaper on a flat surface to make sure this is nice and flat. I want this perfectly flat because we want a perfectly flat finish. As I lightly go over this first area, you can see the little bits of the shiny spots. Now this is where the finish kind of sunk into the grain of the wood, and that's why we're sanding it. We want to remove all of the high spots until everything has the same dull sheen. To get a couple of the areas around the edge of the body, I've switched over to a nice flat stick. I ran this stick through my drum sander to make sure it's nice and flat and smooth. Works really good for getting into smaller areas. The longer stick I like because it helps me keep it nice and flat. I don't end up tipping it one way or another as much as if it was a really small block. And while I'm working on the back, I'm going to use a razor blade as a miniature card scraper and clean out any excess finish that got into the recess for the control cavity. Now I can move on to the sides. I'm using the same process, just slowly making my way around the guitar, making sure the finish is nice and level. Sometimes I use a bright light to shine across the surface. It kind of helps any of the low spots to show up. Sometimes it's hard to see with just regular shop lighting. You got to add a little bit of extra light. I think we're looking pretty good. So now with everything sanded to 1000 grit, I'm going to repeat that exact same process now with some 1500 grit. I'm going to spare you guys that because, well, really it's the same process as I just did, except this is going to go a lot quicker because everything's already nice and flat. All we really need to do is make sure we remove the 1000 grit sanding scratches so that we can polish it up to a nice high gloss shine. To do the polishing, I'm going to be using the last 2 steps of the 3-step Perfect It system. Now typically you'd start out with more of a cutting compound, moving up to a finer finishing compound and a very fine polish. Now this finishing process uses different colored buffing pads that go with the color-coded caps. Each pad is a different density and it works well with the color-coordinated compound, working up to this final blue compound, which is a super fine. That's where we really get to shine. I've done a lot of polishing using a pad on my random orbit sander, and that works just fine, but this time around I'm using a little bit more specific tool made specifically for this task. Shake well before using. Well guys, the shine is there, but there's a slight flaw in my process. There's still sanding scratches in here. So somewhere along the lines, I didn't sand this fine enough. I talked to the rep at the paint store as well as my brother for some insight on this, and apparently I probably should have spent a little more time sanding, at least taking this up to 2000 grit. I probably didn't get all of the initial sanding scratches out, and also the 3-step polishing process where I'm using only step 2 and 3, I probably need to use like step 1 and step 2. The step 1 compound is typically a little coarser and will take out more of those sanding scratches. So it's how we learn, it's how we get better. I don't think I'll cover the whole entire process here in this video because it's going to be very similar. Well, really it's going to look identical to what I just did, but I'm going to start back at 1000 grit, reblock everything out, spend a little bit more time going through the grits. I even got some 1200 grit, so I might add a grit in there, make sure I get this nice and smooth. I'm not worried too much about sanding through the clear. I think there's enough clear on there where this is going to work okay, and then we'll have a look and see where we're at. Hopefully we don't have any more scratches. I'm going to start on the back this time just to be safe and make sure that this process is going to work before I re-sand the front. Also, this time around, I am not going to sand in a circular pattern. I'm going to use the sanding block as much as I can and sand in a straight line. Also, this time around, starting at 1500 grit, I'm going to wet sand this body. I wasn't originally planning on wet sanding, but I think I'm going to get a better quality finish by doing the wet sanding. That's looking a lot better. I don't see those nasty sanding scratches that I had in there earlier. Nice. I'm very happy with that. Man, am I relieved that that got those sanding scratches out there. I had a little bit of heart failure earlier because I thought I really had a big issue, but really the issue was I honestly was trying to cut some corners, eliminate a couple of steps, and really that's not the way to go. I was trying to speed up the process by skipping a couple of grits, skipping a step of the polish. I thought it would really work out well, but turns out it doesn't. So my process now is to sand this up to 2000 grit. I'm going to dry sand to 1000 grit, then I'm going to wet sand up to 2000 grit. Then I'm going to use a step 1 and a step 2 polish. I'm not sure yet if I'm going to need the step 3 because I really had a nice shine after that step 2. So that looks like it's the way to go. Moral of the story here, what are we taking away from this? Don't cut corners. Spend the time, do the wet sanding, do the polishing, follow the grits, and you're going to have great results. So I'm going to finish polishing this up, flip this thing over, and I'm going to do the exact same thing to the front, and then we're going to take a quick look at it. Well guys, there it is. We are ready now, after a little bit of cleanup work, to start assembling this. I can't wait to start getting some parts on there. We had a few snags along the way, but we got worked through those. This thing came out awesome. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Stick around, and we will see you in the next episode. Bam! It's on fire! Hey, nice shirt. Whoa, incoming. So while you guys are seeing the other projects popping up on the channel, I'm waiting for this to dry.